Today we'll be going and doing an overview of the President's budget and sharing some of the highlights of the good and the bad, I want to say, of the President's budget as we move forward. And we do have a slide deck. I'm just double checking to make sure that you can see it from the screen. We can see it here, but we're just trying to make sure that the screen can see, you guys can all see it. Also, just want to let you know, Maria will give us some instructions about how to raise your hand and other kinds of things. But first of all, I just want to welcome you to the webinar. So Maria, do you want to give the instructions?
Yes, thank you, Jackie. You'll notice that on your toolbar for the webinar, there are a few options. There's raise your hand. That's for questions later on in during the webinar. And there's also a questions tab where you can type out a question and we'll be able to see it and it'll pop up on our screen so that we can answer questions while you have them going through the webinar. So with that, we'll turn it over to Amber.
So just a little precursor on this budget webinar. You know, there's a couple of things happening, and I don't want us to get all confused. The first thing is this budget webinar is really dealing with the fiscal year 2019 budget that the President has submitted to Congress. We know that we're still in play for the fiscal year 2018 budget, and so you know, Amber may give us some indications of the status of where we are with 2018. So I just want to make sure that very clear. You know, we'll be talking about the 2019 budget, but you know, at the end of this week and next week, the fiscal year 2018 budget is very much in play. And this presentation was originally developed so that we could update the Tribal Budget Advisory Committee members, the TBIC members for Department of Interior, and then we realized how important it was for this information to be shared with all of the tribal leaders and those representatives who want to hear it. I just wanted to give a shout out to the TBIC members who meet on a real regular basis with the Department of Interior as they try to negotiate and inform the department on tribal priorities, and it's so important to have those representatives from each of your regions. NCAI really appreciates their leadership, and also wanted to give a shout out to Amber, Amber Ebarb, who is our point person for the providing technical assistance to the Tribal Budget Advisory Committee. And she is also the lead that helps develop our budget book from NCAI. We call her our in-house budget guru. And I'm going to turn it over to Amber Ebar, our in-house budget guru.
Thank you, Jackie. We're going to get started. First, we're going to do okay, here we go. Here's our agenda. I want to talk about the Bipartisan Budget Act first and how it impacts the President's budget and the remaining work on the omnibus. Then I'll get into the details of the actual President's budget for FY 2019 and focus on BIA and IHS, a little bit of HUD, some reference to programs at Treasury and Labor. So first, we have multiple things moving when it comes to the federal budget. We had the constraints under the Budget Control Act of 2011 that we remember known as sequestration. We have a major opportunity right now, though, with the passage of the Bipartisan Budget Act and the increases it provides potentially for appropriations bills, the non-defense discretionary side of the federal budget. The Bipartisan Budget Act raised the limits on defense and non-defense appropriations for both FY18 and FY19 that were set in the 2011 Budget Control Act. And this deal is similar to the ones that were passed in 2013 and 2015, those two-year deals to raise the budget cap. However, the Bipartisan Budget Act deal actually adds funding above the original pre-sequester caps. That means it fully repeals sequestration for 2 years, 2018 and 2019, and adds additional non-defense discretionary funding above the caps. Specifically, it raises NDD, as we call non-defense discretionary funding, by $63 billion in FY 2018 and $68 billion in FY 19. It also abides by the parity principle in that it provides increases above the caps in similar amounts for defense and non-defense. So that was something we were not sure if it would go through or not. But if we want to put the bipartisan budget deal in context, this is a graph from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and you can see that the increases don't actually expand appropriated programs beyond their historic levels. It returns funding to where it was if you look back to 2010, $611 billion provided in 2010, and this is dollars adjusted for inflation to $18 to make them constant. The new adjusted for inflation, the new cap on NDD appropriations in 2018 is still 5.3% below its comparable 2010 level. And then they do an additional analysis that if you adjust this 2018 or this amount for population growth as well as inflation, it would be 11% below the 2010 level. So while this is initially it looks like a major increase, repealing sequestration for 2 years and adding additional funding for non-defense discretionary spending, which is where most tribal programs are funded. That includes Bureau of Indian Affairs, Indian Health Service, HUD programs, Indian Housing Block Grant, et cetera. Those are included in these larger caps for non-defense discretionary funding. So putting into context where the Bipartisan Budget Act got us is really important for anticipating what it will actually feel like on the ground. Next, we have the non-defense discretionary, the NDD funding in the President's budget compared to the Bipartisan Budget Act. So what does this actually mean when you compare the 2018 levels, including the caps that have the sequester in it, the President's budget from 2018, and then the Bipartisan Budget Act? What do those increases look like? So the President's non-defense budget moves in a completely opposite direction from the Bipartisan Budget Act, which raised the limits on both defense and non-defense, as I mentioned, for 2018 and 2019. And it really was a bipartisan budget act in increasing those caps. However, the administration's budget calls for spending much less in 2019 on non-defense programs than the agreement specifies. Then, in subsequent years, it would cut these spending levels well below even what full sequestration would require. I don't have the future out years, but it is, and their projections includes much deeper cuts than 2019. Because the President's budget had been finalized and sent to the printer before the Bipartisan Budget Act was announced, the administration provided what they called an addendum for 2019 that recognizes the bipartisan budget agreement, but just to a limited extent. The administration lays out about $75 billion in additions to its 2019 budget, proposing total non-defense discretionary funding of $540 billion in 2019, and you can see that that's the gray bar in the FY 2019 column. That's the 540 in NDD funding, and it looks like it's an increase, but it applies to a budget that would have cut non-defense discretionary appropriations $132 billion below the agreement level and even below the sequester, what sequester cuts required. So even with the addendum that increased, that called for increases, it's still, the Trump plan calls for spending $57 billion less in 2019 than the revised non-defense cap enacted in the Bipartisan Budget Act. So what I'm trying to say is the $540 billion figure overstates what the administration is proposing, because more than half of the additions don't really increase funding levels. For example, it involves shifting ongoing spending that are mandatory spending to the regular non-defense discretionary category, and then it makes them subject to the non-defense cap. That's the case with the SDPI program, which we'll cover later. which was proposed to be converted to discretionary spending from its current mandatory status, opposite of what tribes have been calling for. So that's some context for the president's budget. It does provide some increases, but there's some moving funds around that makes it hard to track exactly what this will mean for the appropriations process. And of course, the outlook for passage is, we had a lot of discussion with members of Congress at the Executive Council winter session a few weeks ago, and even the messaging around the rollout of the president's budget shows that the OMB director called it their own president's budget, a messaging document. And so the fact that it doesn't spend all of the funding that was allowed for under the increase in the Budget Control Act spending caps, that in itself makes it more of a messaging document, an effort to decrease spending across the board for domestic programs. The congressional response, we heard from a number of Republicans and Democrats, and there was bipartisan agreement that the proposed reductions would be addressed during the congressional appropriation cycle. We heard a quote from Don Young, who said, this may be my president, but this is not my budget. And then another example, Senator Merkley noted there will be bipartisan rejection of the cuts of $500 million to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And he went on, we know that we all need a better partner of Indian country, meaning Congress's support for tribes. So there is an alternative. NCAI worked with many tribal partners in developing an Indian country budget request. This is the cover of our 2019 document that's available on our website and includes details on a range of programs and most of the federal agencies, all of the significant tribal programs that have budget consultation and government-to-government processes on developing federal budget priorities for tribes are included in this Indian country budget document. The overarching themes are kind of back to basics, so we can educate members of the administration and Congress who might not totally understand the relationship tribes have with the federal government and the role that the federal spending plays in Indian country in our economies. First, we started out with a basic intro to the treaty and trust responsibility, the basics and the fundamentals. And we wanted to point out that for a nation that bases its greatness on its rule of law, treaties and intergovernmental agreements carry paramount importance. And the quote from Supreme Court Justice Samuel Miller was incorporated, that a treaty is primarily a compact between independent nations. It depends for the enforcement of its provisions on the interest and the honor of the governments which are parties of it. So that's the underpinning the treaty relationships, and then we go on to make the argument or a reminder to members of Congress about how between our nations, these are fundamental promises. And we know that over the last 2 centuries, the United States, a nation founded on Indian land, has become the richest economy in the world. So the map on the cover of our budget document shows Indian land cessions from the post-colonial period to 1893. And as America expanded, federal Indian policy led to the loss of billions of acres of land, but the related promises the U.S. made in exchange for this land too often remain unfulfilled. So our FY 2019 budget request includes federally funded programs and services that honor the trust responsibility in coordination with numerous tribal organizations, and the acknowledgements in the back show where all of the tribal orgs and tribal leaders that we've worked with to develop these recommendations. We also wanted to emphasize that the role that federal spending plays in improving and fostering economic development in Indian country. This shows the probability of reaching the top income quintile from the bottom quintile, which is essentially just a measure of opportunity. And you can see that opportunity is not as, these darker areas show where there's less opportunity. The measure is essentially showing where populations do better than your parents. It's a measure of upward intergenerational mobility. And reservations, you can see, except for Oklahoma and a few other areas, have very dark areas indicating lower opportunity. But prosperity for Indian country is different than for the rest of the United States often, where for the rest of the country, the American dream is based on income success. For tribes, it often includes preservation of culture and family and homeland. But a part of improving and fostering economic development, to a large degree, a common factor cited as hindering economic development is the need for adequate federal funds for basic governmental services, such as public safety, housing, education, and workforce development. On top of that is the insufficient infrastructure, including roads, housing, water, sewer, and broadband. So we wanted to emphasize that not only is this a moral obligation, it makes economic sense as well. On the next slide here, we just as a summary of the fiscal trust responsibility and how, while we're working to improve economic growth in Indian country and see the need for a multifaceted approach, including legal infrastructure and commercial codes, a large part of the growth puzzle still includes relying on improving basic physical infrastructure and other fundamental aspects of the trust responsibility. As an example, we have tribal public safety funding need, and this is a really core responsibility of any government. And the underfunding of tribal law enforcement and justice is well documented. This data and this graph is based on a report BIA submitted to Congress in 2016, estimating that to provide a minimum base level of service to all federally recognized tribes, $1 billion is needed for tribal law enforcement, $1 billion is needed for tribal courts, and $222.8 million is needed to fund existing detention centers. Based on recent appropriations, though, BIA is generally funding tribal law enforcement at about just 20% of estimated need, detention at about 40%, and tribal courts at a dismal 3% of estimated need. So on the president's budget, we have some details. Here's the higher level, some of the major reductions. We have proposed in the president's budget an 8% reduction to the Native American Housing Block Grant, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs will be cut by $450 million or 15% from FY18, the current CR level. Major reductions include social services, ICWA, welfare assistance, rights protection, and job placement and training, all cuts disproportionate to what the Department of Interior would be cut by. Other top-level eliminations across agencies are the Indian Community Development Block Grant, LIHEAP, Indian and Native American, the INAP program in Department of Labor, Tribal Energy Loan Guarantee Program, and other eliminations listed here, which are very important to a number of regions and tribes, including scholarships, Johnson O'Malley housing improvement, and the Small and Needy Tribes program at BIA. However, there were some proposed increases in the president's budget. There's an increase proposed of $350 million to expand direct health care services at IHS. There would be $150 million proposed for opioid multi-year competitive grants. This is out of the $10 billion proposed for opioid funding nationally. And then in the Department of Justice, the budget proposes a 5% set aside from the Crime Victims Fund for providing services to crime victims. Indian tribes haven't directly ever received funding from the CVF. This would result in $115 million, so that would be that's a good proposed increase. and then another 7% set aside from Office of Justice programs, totaling about, and this is based on our initial calculations, $93.8 million for tribal assistance. And so it would result in a significant increase. However, there would need to be much consultation on how this would be implemented, and Virginia Davis has been working on the consultations with DOJ and how they would implement that. So specifically, because this was initially for the Tribal Interior Budget Council, I'm going to focus initially on the Bureau of Indian Affairs FY 2019 budget. Here we see a simple chart that shows funding for BIA, I should say, and BIE funding from 2003 to fiscal year 2019 in the President's budget. And this is the actual amount. It doesn't adjust for inflation or anything. But the 19 request is $2.4 billion, or as I mentioned before, a decrease of 15.6%. This is $443.9 million below the FY18 continuing resolution amount. Then if you do adjust for inflation, you can see that the 19 proposed level is lower than any other year going back all the way to 2003. And if you look at 2010, right before sequestration and the Budget Control Act was implemented, and just look at the decline from 2010 to the 2019 proposed level, that would be about a decrease of 25%, adjusting for inflation. So this would be a significant decline if the proposed amount for the Bureau of Indian Affairs would be accepted by Congress. But we know that many members of Congress are already opposing the decreases, and we know that because, as I mentioned earlier, the Bipartisan Budget Act provided so many more resources for non-defense discretionary spending, there will be a lot more for Congress to work with. That means it will be important to weigh in with appropriators that these decreases, 25% reduction or 15% just from FY18, are untenable and represent a clear retreat from the federal commitments the United States has to Indian tribes. This is another analysis comparing the Bureau of Indian Affairs to other bureaus in the Department of Interior. And Red Lake, one of the Tribal Interior Budget Council members, Dave Connor, shared this with me, and you can see the dollar decrease proposed in the 2019 budget for the Bureau of Indian Affairs compared to Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Reclamation, USGS, BLM, and National Park Service. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs has the largest dollar decrease in the 2019 President's budget compared at least to the 2017 enacted amount. This shows Indian Affairs as the biggest loser when it comes to the President's budget request for interior agencies. Looking at the priority ranking of tribes from all of the BIA regions, this is a simple graph that shows the top programs as identified by tribes in the 2019 budget formulation process. And this is the result of regions submitting their top programs to the Tribal Interior Budget Council, and then it rolls up. Of course, this process is being improved, but even so, looking at what rose to the top in the previous cycle is informative. And you see at the top is Social Services, second, Indian Child Welfare Act, tied for third is scholarships, tribal courts, and aid to tribal government. So those are the top 5 programs. And then criminal investigations, HIP, JOM, road maintenance, detention corrections, all the way down, welfare assistance, small and needy tribes, Indian guaranteed loan program subsidies. This is just to help see what are the priorities compared to what the President included in the Bureau of Indian Affairs budget. To do that comparison, this is the same top listing of programs, except on the left is the proposed reductions to these top priorities. Every single one would see a reduction in the FY19 president's budget, unfortunately. The top one, social services, would see a decrease of 37%, ICWA, a decrease of 27%, scholarships eliminated. The ones in red are the ones that are eliminated and zeroed out. Those zeroing outs include housing improvement, Johnson O'Malley, and small and needy tribes, and scholarships, as I mentioned. The only ones that didn't get a proportionate decrease compared to Interior would be road maintenance, detention, forestry, the ones that are lower percent decreases, but they're still decreases to the top priority areas. So that's, before I get to IHS, I think one of the important messages to share is with the appropriators, it might make I think it's important to point out this disparity in what's included in the president's budget compared to what tribes have identified as significant and important programs needing infusion of support in the 2019 budget. So we can work to rectify these problems in the appropriation cycle, which is already starting and kicked off. On the Indian Health Service, it's not quite as bad as the Bureau of Indian Affairs. There's actually an increase overall for the IHS budget. However, there are some changes that are problematic. So overall, though, there would be a proposed amount of $5.4 billion, $413 million over the 2018 CR, and an 8% increase over the current CR level. But the proposal cuts or eliminates several important programs at IHS, and NIHB pointed out that the proposed amount of $5.4 billion is about $1 billion less than what was recommended by the IHS Tribal Budget Formulation Work Group, which was $6.4 billion in FY 2019. Another problem that we are concerned about in the president's budget is this proposal for moving the special diabetes program from mandatory status to discretionary. That would mean that Congress would have to provide funding each year in its dysfunctional appropriations process to SDPI through the annual appropriations process. And as I mentioned earlier, this proposal moves in the opposite policy direction. Tribes and NCAI has a resolution calling for making the entire IHS budget mandatory instead of discretionary. There's also a proposal for funding for opioids. The president's budget includes $10 billion to combat the opioid epidemic overall, and out of that, IHS would receive $150 million from the budget in brief to provide multi-year competitive grants based on need to support Indian country. In an earlier meeting today, though, and we've discussed this on our team a bit, competitive grants just are not the best way to administer this funding, and a formula basis would be preferable. Next, there are some cuts proposed to the IHS budget, even though there's an overall increase, and part of that increase I should mention is that moving SDPI from mandatory to discretionary, but there are other eliminations and reductions in the IHS's proposed budget. It would eliminate the community health representative program, that's $60 million, health education program, that's $19 million, and tribal management grants. Reductions would include cuts to the health facilities construction program by $38 million from $117 million. The budget in brief mentions that their reductions are to prioritize direct health care services and staffing and operating costs for new and replacement facilities. There's also some ACA proposed changes it's unlikely that these will be passed this year, but it is included in the president's budget. And some of the ones we've been monitoring, Medicaid spending would be replaced with a block grant to states, and this is significant in that Medicaid provides substantial resources to the IHS's budget, which is already underfunded. It would also, the proposed budget, eliminate subsidies for the ACA's health insurance marketplace. Next, there are some other policy changes proposed. This one is about the SNAP program. The budget would propose to cut the SNAP program by 22% over the next decade. And you may have read in the news, the administration would change the SNAP program into a food box delivery system for eligible SNAP participants who receive at least $90 a month in SNAP benefits. And this is important to tribes and Indian country, as about a quarter of Native households currently use SNAP, and in some tribal communities, it's more than half of households that are recipients of SNAP. Last, we have some other proposed reductions in Department of Labor and Treasury. The president's budget would zero out funding for the Department of Labor's Division of Indian and Native American programs. And we know DINAP is a vital workforce development division specifically dedicated to working with tribes and Native organizations, specifically Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act Section 166 grantees. It supports the provision of quality employment and training services to unemployed and low-income Native people. Ian on our staff and a few of our partners are working to address some of the proposed, or this proposed elimination, and the OMB documents that includes the justification has some questionable conclusions about its effectiveness, but we're working to address those in working with the House Appropriators and Senate Committee on Indian Affairs and Senate Appropriators as well. Second, in Treasury, the community development financial institutions would be, the Native American CDFI assistance would be eliminated, $15.5 million, and 3 other discretionary CDFI grant programs. We'll be working to restore those. Those are really critical programs for Indian country that lack financial institutions. Last, we have the upcoming opportunities for advocacy, and you may have received the notice yesterday that May 9th and 10th will be the dates that the House Appropriations Subcommittee in Ontario will hold their tribal public witness hearing. The deadline to request is April 6th, 2018, so that's always an important day of advocacy, a couple days of advocacy. And March 21st, next week, is the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs hearing on the president's budget. So we would encourage participation in these opportunities for sharing the priorities and needs of Indian country when it comes to the federal budget. There's also a number of opportunities in the Commerce, Justice, Science Appropriations Bill, Transportation HUD Appropriations, Agriculture. I think we focus a lot on the Interior Appropriations Bill, but there are many others where there are major programs that serve tribes that should also not be left out of our advocacy efforts. But that is the presentation that I've developed, and if there are any questions, I hope that I can answer them and figure out how to navigate the webinar. But I think you can raise your hand, as Maria said, or you can type questions into the chat box. So if there's anyone who has any questions, I'd be open to those. Otherwise, we'll wrap up the webinar. So let me see if I can find any. The one question is a copy of the presentation available offline. yes, we'll, there's a report that I get after the webinar of everyone who's joined, and I'll download that and email a copy of the presentation to everyone who signed up and attended. Okay, here's some more questions. I'm just figuring it out. Okay. Can you expand on the food delivery? Is the FY 2019 President's budget proposal proposing something like Blue Apron? Yeah, we were reading about this proposal, and it's got some mixed support, I think, from tribes. I think it is supposed to be something like Blue Apron and use federal subsidized or the surplus food. It is similar to, there are a number of articles recently that it's similar to the commodity program that Indian Country has experience with, and there's mixed opinion about how, what about choice, what about, like, what are the types of foods that would be available in a box program like that. That's something that our team, Maria Gibbons, is looking into and pulling together. We don't have any official position on it. We're still looking at it, but that is a unique sort of proposal. So if anyone has other opinions that you would like to share with NCAI or Maria, feel free to email us if you have specific concerns or support. We're gathering information about that. We have another question. How soon do you expect the FY 2018 budget to be finalized? We were following the omnibus action. It's been very exciting the last few days that we might actually get a final spending bill instead of a continuing resolution after 5 CRs just for the 18 budget, or 18 spending bills, FY 18, that we might get a new appropriations for all of the programs that tribes care about. I think that the House was going to release their omnibus early this week. We're looking for what's going to be included in that. And like I mentioned, because there are increases for non-defense discretionary, we expect that there will be some increases for all NDD programs, but hopefully specifically for tribal programs based on the record that the appropriators have of the 2018 process and all of the testimony and letters that tribes have sent and shared with members on those appropriations committees. So we're hopeful that once the bill is released, we're monitoring it for other things as well, in addition to funding levels such as, TLSA and remote sales tax, a few other kind of policy provisions that could be attached to it. So it could be very soon. March 23rd is the deadline for that's when the current CR expires. So Congress will have to finalize their work on the FY 18 omnibus by March 23rd. Here's another question. As we move down further past the hearings on the Interior and President's proposed budget, can we get a more refined presentation as this process goes along? This is helpful when we have varied programs that fear losing programs and services. Yes, we'll do as the appropriation season goes forward, we'll do analysis. For instance, once the omnibus is released, we'll do a quick analysis and find all the tribal programs that are important and consolidate those into a document similar to our President's budget analysis and share that with our NCAI distribution list. So hopefully everyone on this is a part of that. If not, you can reach out to me if you want to receive those budget broadcasts, and I can add you to a separate list for specific budget advocacy. And I know there is a lot of concern about what this means, how the President's budget will be received by Congress, and many of these eliminations are really really pretty bad. So we'll do our best to keep you in the loop about what is happening as the process moves along. Next one, here's another comment that the LIHEAP program and impact aid reductions amount to a loss of $37 million and $276 million for Indian country. What kind of social media campaign can we launch to educate Indian country on these proposals? That's true. LIHEAP and impact aid are significant funding streams. And I know that at our winter session conference, we had many comments about the elimination of LIHEAP and the reductions to impact aid. And we made a statement, I forgot to include a slide on this. We made a statement at the winter session about expressing our tribe's response to the president's budget. And that's a press release that went out on, I think, February 14th or 15th. It was based on one of the declarations from the 1950s, Declaration of Indian Purpose. We wanted to be on the record of expressing dismay at what the president was proposing for many important tribal programs that fulfill the trust responsibility. And that's not exactly a social media response, but we did take some of the statements from that, or small, I should say, pieces from the statement, and converted it to social media posts. I think in the last year we put together a toolkit that consolidated ways that tribes could engage in advocacy around this, and I think it would be helpful to do something similar specifically on social media, since that's a major way to get the news out about what's happening. So I'll be working with our teams to figure out some of those strategies. There's a question about the push for the Tribal Labor Sovereignty Act to be included on the 18 spending bill. And we have been working on that. We had a meeting here at NCAI with tribal advocates this morning and shared what we knew. I think I'm not the expert, it's not my issue area at TLSA, but based on the conversations, it's still important to weigh in with leadership about, especially Democrats, on how important this is for tribes to get it added to or keep it in the 18 spending bill. I'm not sure if it's in or not. Last question. Disappointed to see that community health representative funding is eliminated. CHRs provide irreplaceable services like in-home assessments, glucose testing, and transportation. Yeah, I agree, and that came up in some of our meetings this morning about the community health reps being eliminated in the IHS proposed budget. But like I mentioned, it will be important to weigh in with the appropriators on this coming up really soon. And I know that we wanted to hold this webinar so we could share what we have read about in the news, and talking with members of Congress about how the proposals would be received by appropriators and eventually passed. So I think we have a lot of work ahead of us to do some education and let members, especially appropriators, know what these proposed eliminations actually do on the ground for tribes. There's another question about could we provide more details on what appears to be a $47 million reduction in BIA contract support costs. I know that I think that it fully funds CSC and the BIA's budget, but I think because the overall budget is reduced, that has the contract support cost amount goes down proportionally. So I think that's what the $47 million reduction is. I haven't seen anything that contradicts that assumption, and I know in reading the budgets in brief and the justifications, that seems to be the case. But I'll double check on that and let you know if I find anything different. So thank you everyone for the questions and comments. You're welcome to send any other follow-up notes to me, or if there are things that you'd like to see reported on in our future analysis or broadcast, let me know. We always want to do our best in covering the programs that are important to tribes. So like I said, the next steps will be looking at the omnibus when that comes out. That will be a big effort in analyzing what's included in that budget or that bill. And in addition to some of the policy writers, TLSA and some of the others, will be excited to take a look at that. I have one last question that just came in. Did anyone look at our priority list, why the cuts and eliminations to top priority items? I think looking back at the budget in brief and the Green Book, the priority list, you're right. If we go back to the this list of priorities, why were these reduced? I think some of the justifications were a little bit different. Social services and ICWA, those were reduced because Tawahe was being reduced. Same with, I think, tribal courts and HIP, but that doesn't mean that they should have been eliminated entirely in HIP's case. One of the justifications or rationales on the phone call with John Tsuda right after the president's budget came out was their intention to focus on programs that serve all tribes as opposed to a subset of tribes. So the example they gave was Johnson O'Malley, although we know that that's not I think it was Johnson O'Malley. I can't remember exactly. The Small-Aniti actually might have been the one where that was used. They wanted to focus on programs that serve the most tribes, the most regions. And then in the case of Johnson O'Malley, I think their justification was to meet their what they called core responsibilities for Bureau of Indian Education. There was some pushback on that during the call, though, with Johnson O'Malley serving a large number of students and one of the few programs that serves American Indian students in public schools. So we'll be working to, I think, comparing the top priority areas to what's included in the president's budget will make it easy, I hope, to restore these reductions in the 19 process. So that's just a note on strategy. All right, that's all of the questions I have so far. And like I said, just send me an email if you have anything that comes up. There's a Tribal Interior Budget Council meeting next week, March 20th, are the subcommittees, the Education Subcommittee, Roads, Budget Subcommittee, and Public Safety and Justice will be meeting, the pre-meetings, and then the full Tribal Interior Budget Council is the 21st and 22nd. The IHS budget formulation just wrapped up last week or recently, so that's the presentation, and thank everyone for joining me to discuss the president's budget and what's going on with appropriations. All right, thank you, and I'm going to wrap up.